Good morning. My name's Andy Shenstone, and I'm a director here with Advance AG. And you've joined the first of our panel sessions here today at the Advance AG conference, being streamed live. The focus of this session, which will run through till about 11:40 or thereabouts, is going to be exploring and discussing the role of governance in the new normal, looking at the models for governance that we have in this nation and how they may need to develop and evolve in an era in which we are having to cope with coronavirus, COVID-19, and in a future environment in which the threat and the challenges arising from that environment will undoubtedly continue and evolve. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my fellow panel members to join us, if they would like to come into the virtual room, and I'll make some introductions and then we will get the conversation started. I'm just waiting our third panel member to join us. I see we've got Michael and Steve, and fantastic, and there's Martha too. So a really warm welcome to my fellow panel members. A brief introduction as in the profiles your colleagues will have seen for this event. Michael Queen. Michael is chair of the Committee of University Chairs and chair of the University of Surrey. Professor Steve West is Vice Chancellor of the University of the West of England, and Martha Longden is past President of Nottingham Trent Students' Union and is presently Chair of the Office for Students Student Panel. So a really warm welcome to you all, Michael, Stephen and Mark. Fantastic you could join us today. Just getting straight into the conversation, straight into the exchange, and then as we get this going, we'll see what questions colleagues who are observing and participating in the virtual conference want to throw at us, and we'll see how many of those we can pick up as we go. Initially, a reflection to yourself, Michael. Given what we've experienced in the past 7 or 8 months here in UK higher education, and given your perspective both as a chair of a governing body but also chair of CUC, to what extent do you think our approach into the governance of our universities needs to change in the light of COVID? And if it does need to change, why and in what way?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I think coronavirus hasn't fundamentally changed anything, but what it's done is it's accelerated a trend in increased scrutiny and expectations of university. I mean, the sector is of interest to politicians, media, the general public, and most importantly of all, our students expect high standards, particularly given the fees that they're paying. And when we look at sectors that receive this level of legitimate public interest, we typically see two things happen. Firstly, you see more regulation, it's imposed. And secondly, governance needs to improve, both to meet the increased expectations, but also as a means of limiting the need for too onerous regulatory insight. And we've seen this pattern happen in many other sectors. So water, electricity, and particularly in financial services. So it's no surprise that universities are being subject to increased scrutiny, particularly given the changes that have happened in the sector. And it's worthwhile just reflecting. I mean, I came into this sector and it's extraordinary how different it is from when I went to university myself. When only 10% of the population, 18-year-olds, went to university to 50%. We've changed from a grant system to substantial fees. And we've also moved from a relatively benign regulatory environment led by Hofke to a much more customer-focused, assertive regulator in OFS. And at the same time, our students' own experience of what good customer service looks like has been radically impacted by things like Amazon, Uber Eats, and the access to information online. So they're able to assess what does good look like in a much more thoughtful way than we've ever had before. And the final change I'd say that we've seen is that governments increasingly recognize that universities are an enormous source of economic growth and international competitive advantage. So, if we look at all of those changes, how have universities fared? Well, they're obviously much larger than they were historically, but the essence of a university education hasn't changed that much. And some argue that's a good thing, and that the strength of a university lies in protecting tradition and not being blown around by the trends of the moment. And I certainly think that the essence of universities needs to be protected at all costs. But I think we can do that by delivering a much better experience for students, getting more value for research, and adding value to all our local, national, and international communities. So, in my view, universities have been undergoverned for quite a long time. And this is improving, but it's not improving at the pace at which the expectations of the sector are increasing. So when we compare the role and structure of governing councils and bodies in other sectors, we can see immediately there are a number of changes that can be made. So typically universities are too large. 24 to 30 people is not an effective size to deliver good governance. 4 or 5 meetings a year is insufficient to be able to make a substantial contribution to an institution. And councils need greater diversity. And that's diversity in all respects, but with particular emphasis on the diversity of experience and thought. Now, as I noted earlier, if we have weak governance, then that leads to increased regulatory scrutiny, quite rightly. And at the moment, we can expect more regulation from the OFS once the current pandemic is over. So if we look at how have universities dealt with coronavirus, well, I think in the main, incredibly well. I think actually institutions have shocked themselves at what they could achieve in such a short time. Staff have performed heroically right across the sector, and decisions have been taken quickly and followed through efficiently. Now, it's interesting because crisis situations often lead to what I call a surge of organizational adrenaline. As a sector, we must keep up this higher level of performance once the crisis is over. Governance as well has had to adapt. There's been much more contact, or certainly there has been, with the Vice Chancellor and Chair of Council. And of course, committee meetings and council meetings themselves have been much more flexible via Zoom or Teams. And whether we're in a crisis or normal conditions, the key to good governance is the relationship between the Vice Chancellor and the Chair of Council. So while there's been much more contact, the Vice Chancellor is also needed to be able to take quick decisions, sometimes that are right on the edge of the governance framework. And the Vice Chancellor needs to have confidence that they'll get the support of Council, and equally, the Council needs to know that the Vice Chancellor is not going to push too far. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the CUC is to provide practical and relevant support for members to get this balance right. The recent Code of Governance is a best practice document that most universities should be able to adopt. And in fact, later on this seminar, John Rushford, the director of the CUC, will be talking more about that and its application in practice. But one of the key things that universities need to address is how we engage students in the governance process. Typically, the president of the student union is a member of council, and there are other mechanisms for sabbatical officers to be involved. But we need to reach out much more to get a wider, diverse range of student views and opinion. And the good news is there are many ways this can be done. And we can again learn from other sectors that are constantly assessing what their customers or members want and feel. So many universities are now using pulse surveys to get rapid feedback on issues. And academically, systems such as Unitu allow feedback on lectures, seminars, and tutorials so that we can follow up issues very quickly. At Surrey, we've created a Student Experience Committee, which is a committee, formal committee of the council, with 10 student representatives that cover all the faculties in both undergraduate and postgraduate students. But above all, we need to create a culture that is obsessed with student experience. And this is readily achievable, but it needs clear and decisive leadership and good governance. So a strong, well-run council can add significant value to this process, bringing experience and support to the executive teams that are coping with incredibly demanding and complex issues. The universities are one of the UK's few leading global sectors. We really, as an outsider to the sector, I can tell you, this is an incredibly impressive group of organisations that have a massive impact on society and is viewed incredibly positively internationally. And what we've shown through coronavirus is a remarkable level of creativity, flexibility, and adaptability. And we need to maintain this and challenge ourselves to take the lessons of the pandemic and improve all the aspects of what we do. While coronavirus has been horrendous and we've still got lots to deal with, I think I'm very optimistic that we can use this experience in a positive way. I'm also convinced that students that have experienced the pandemic as part of their university education will graduate as more thoughtful and positive members of society.
Thank you, Michael. A really inspiring set of reflections to kick off our panel discussion. Some questions coming in already, but I'm going to invite Professor Steve West to come and share his reflections on these issues from his perspective as a Vice Chancellor of long standing. But I'll just flag for you for one of the questions, Michael, that we might return to in our later discussion is being raised by a couple of colleagues is, well, if this rhythm of the current schedule of meetings is insufficient, what is a better model? What might be more appropriate going forward? But I'll leave that one hanging. And if I might immediately turn to yourself, Steve, either to pick up on some of those themes that Michael's unpacked for us there, or to take us in a different direction as you see fit on these really important points.
Yeah, Vice Chancellors are very good at going off at 180 degrees, but I'll try and keep and follow Michael's theme, so thank you. The starting place, I guess, is COVID-19. It's a fact, pandemics eventually end. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's just how long the tunnel is, I guess. I agree with Michael. I think that we've seen some amazing thing happen during COVID-19 in the way in which universities have responded. Now, fundamentally, for a board and for an executive team, we're still trying to balance both the strategic, the long-term health and vitality of a university alongside the operational. The bit that's changed, of course, is we've also been in the middle of a crisis, and that crisis has required us to clearly focus, make quick decisions, often with pretty vague information, sometimes conflicting information, and of course, getting the rhythm right and the balance right between having to make those decisions and then also bring those bits of information that would help a board support the executive, challenge the executive to make the right decisions is quite difficult. So I think what COVID has taught us very clearly is the need to find mechanisms to engage with board members in ways that we haven't necessarily done in the past. So Vice Chancellors have always worked very closely with chairs and probably have very regular one-to-one meetings, may have been remote over the phone or using Skype or whatever. But the rest of the board, I agree with Michael, probably meets too infrequently in most institutions, so 4 or 5 times a year. My experience is within the NHS, where I'm a non-exec director and have been for, well, too many years probably, is that the pace is much faster. We meet regularly. We're having meetings every month, and most of us are on subcommittees. So we get a better feel and fix about the institution. I think for boards in UK universities, many of them only meeting 4 or 5 times, then with some subcommittees, probably isn't enough, given where we are now, given that scrutiny, and also given that universities actually have put their foot on the accelerator. It's no longer a leisurely stroll. This is really fast. And the decisions that we're making are significant. And I completely agree with Michael in terms of the focus being under public scrutiny, played out in real time, in social media, which is a challenge to all of us, with the press and the political focus, but most importantly, quite rightly, with the gaze of students, the customer, right at the heart of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to deliver. And of course, the difference is that we're trying to ensure that we do this in partnership with our stakeholders, with our students. So it's co-creation. Education is a team sport. Therefore, we have to work effectively together. And sometimes boards, I think, might lose sight of all of this. The real heart of the beating heart of a university. The boards often get very excited about buildings, and they get very excited about big investments, and they get very excited about IT programs that have the potential to trip a university up. But fundamentally, universities are about people. They're about talent. They're about creating futures and opportunities. And for me, the essence of that is sometimes missed in boards. So we've got to work harder, in my view, to make sure that boards are exposed to that. And we had the same problem in the NHS, where often boards forgot actually what they were about. So starting every board meeting with a patient story where the patient comes in, or a staff story where a member of staff came in, warts and all, telling you what it was really like. And of course, walking around and kicking the tires of the place. Now, we can learn from experiences in other sectors and start to bring that into our universities and challenge ourselves, as Michael said. Fundamentally, I agree that the purpose of what we're about, focused on people, focused on place increasingly, so universities having a massive role in their localities. For some, that will be regional and international as well. And then looking at the potential, the prospects, the opportunities, and then making decisions around priorities, how we get our partnerships to work, but also then considering what the impacts of all of that are going to be. And our performance still remain the central planks that boards will be engaging in. I think the challenge for us is that the pace of all of that is much, much faster. I think the scrutiny is more visible. And unfortunately, sometimes that scrutiny is unfair because it's politically motivated in some occasions, and it's played out in media. And that makes it always difficult. I think what we've learned over the past few months is actually there are some simple things vice chancellors can do. So 2 examples from me. One, I did a VC's Q&A, a weekly update to board members, but I also did it to all staff and students. And then alongside that, a 1-hour Q&A, rather similar to this, where staff, students or board members, and they were segmented, could write in. And then I would respond. And that was a fantastic way of keeping board, staff and students up to speed with what was going on. And it allowed me to be very honest in terms of, we don't have all the answers, we don't have all the information, we're going to try this, if it doesn't work, we'll change it. And I think that that's kept board members on side. I think it's given them confidence. That point that Michael said about, vice chancellors are having to make some very rapid decisions. And they need to know that they can challenge that. Those weekly meetings were really critical. And then the final bit, I think the diversity of boards, the size of boards, the way in which board members may be appraised, I think are areas that we could explore, that we can explore as a sector now. And I agree, my board is quite small in comparison to many. I have 12 board members. But even then, it's difficult to keep everybody engaged. So I think we've got lots of opportunities, but let's be brave, let's be bold, and let's ensure that we're thinking about the future. These institutions, as Michael said, are significant. They're significant to the future of the country. They're significant, most of all, to the students and staff who are engaging in the endeavour of education and knowledge.
Thank you, Steve. And lots of questions starting to come through. Quite a few particularly directed towards yourself, Martha. But before we draw those points in, open invitation for you to really share your perspectives and reflections, both on what you've heard Michael and Steve express there, but also your own thinking about how some of these issues particularly resonate given your own lived experience, and also the role that you fulfill in terms of that student piece with the Office for Students and more widely. over to you, Martha.
Fantastic. Well, first, it's great, first of all, to have so many comments from Michael and Steve that are really focused on the student experience, and that should be the atmosphere in every single boardroom up and down the country, everyone thinking about students, not just the student representatives. That's fantastic as a starting point. As Michael said, many of the challenges that we're facing now are not new. They've existed for a long time, but the pandemic has really thrown a spotlight onto some of those really key issues and made them much more widely and deeply felt. Students are very savvy, and they're very well connected. They may not have big communities within their own providers yet, but they know other students from different universities, and they have ways of getting their message out there. So they are really switched on to the problems that are facing themselves and their peers at the moment. The common trends that we're seeing are questions and concerns around student agency, around students being involved in decision-making processes and being done with students rather than imposed on or done to students, and also around communication. I think we all understand there are going to be some significant differences this year, but we want to know what's happening, and even if it's just to say we haven't got the answers yet, that's also really helpful, just to have that awareness. I wanted to reflect a bit on my time as a student governor, actually, and think about how that might have been different in pandemic times, and take kind of a brief whistle-stop tour of the first few months of being a student governor. And this goes right back to elections, actually. So any student governor coming onto a board now will more than likely have been through an election process in a pandemic. A testament to their ability to communicate with students, even when they aren't on campus, even when they're on lockdown. And so their knowledge is absolutely vital to helping reach other students and hear their student voice. They also have the lived experience of being a recent student, of going through exams and coursework, even missing out on graduations, and have just, trying to get through that last bit of experience and gain everything they can whilst being at home or out of labs. And so their experience is so valuable. But not all of them realise it. Some of them, really have issues with confidence, imposter syndrome, or not sure what to expect, particularly in these really fast-moving times. And so it's really helpful to remind them that their voice is valued and their voice is welcome. The induction process for student governors, but for all new governors too, is a really vital piece of the puzzle. Establishing those points of contact early on, so they know who to go to with questions and where to find information. Policy in the sector is changing, sometimes hour by hour, more so now, kind of week by week. We're kind of getting to grips with it now, but they need to be able to keep up to date and to know stay well informed. And so, reflecting on my own time joining the OFS, actually, I hope Steve won't mind me saying that alongside my face-to-face meetings with the chief and with the CEO, the chair of the board even and the CEO, and various members of heads of teams, I also had a brief kind of phone instruction with Steve West when I joined, and just putting that voice at the end of the phone, that person that you can contact if you've got a question or a concern, is so helpful. And it really helped in my first 2 years. It's, I know that I could go to Steve now with a question if I needed to. So establishing those points of contact early on, establishing who those people are, who can support them, who can inform them, and who, won't tell them what to think, but will empower them to share their stories and their voice more loudly in that room. One of the big challenges we always see in the boardroom for student governors is the idea of power imbalances. And I think actually the pandemic has been really integral to maybe changing that for some of our student governors. So as you'll see today, we're all in different spaces. I'm at home, I think Steve's in the office. And just seeing that glimpse into, real people's human lives, whether they've alphabetized their bookshelf and, what their home life is like, really breaks down some of the barriers. It makes everyone feel just a bit more human, a bit more connected. Some of you will also have seen things like GIFs and emojis creeping into your board meetings, which is new and it's different, but it's also, it's a good way of kind of quickly affirming agreement and, expressing opinion. And I think it's interesting to see how students are being able to feel welcome and to do that in that space. And that really is testament to how everyone is trying to really kind of, stick together, be teams and be collegiate. Also, dress code has changed. My colleagues today are looking very dapper. I'm in my jumper, but again, it all helps to just put everyone a bit more at ease and to create that environment where actually you can have very robust discussions, make very good decisions, and to challenge where you need to do. The move to virtual platforms has been difficult for, I think, everybody, particularly those who are not as tech savvy. There have been real challenges particularly with contingencies and making sure that everyone has access to those platforms and knows how to use them. Training for that is really vital. And it's kind of been a missing piece of the puzzle for some people. I think we may have assumed that whilst we're talking about digital poverty for students and ensuring that staff have everything they need to work from home, we've assumed that governors are immune actually to digital poverty, and they're not. It's not necessarily connected to socioeconomic poverty. Those in rural areas and accessing meetings, through dodgy Wi-Fi connections, it can be really difficult. But you need to make sure that all of those voices are in that room. Even just contingencies around making sure that your minute taker always has access to the conversation to ensure that all those conversations are well documented, or how to engage with the students, or what to do if your student governor is out of action for a period of time, and making sure there's always that student interest in the room has also become kind of more important. But it's also created opportunities as well. So there's more training, there are more conferences and webinars online to ensure that all of your governors have access to information to make good, well-informed decisions, and to challenge, ambitious projections for finance and recruitment, and to really understand the changing issues in kind of the emerging landscape. It's also opened up doors for geographical diversity. We talked a lot about getting kind of more diversity of thought, experience and background on panels, but also kind of around the country. And as Michael alluded to earlier, the idea that, 4 to 6 board meetings a year isn't really enough. And it's made us more agile, it's made us more able to communicate in that downtime. And it's also made us in the future more able to respond quickly to emerging issues. And so now I think we'd all have confidence that if something came up at short notice, we could convene our boards online and do a pretty good job of making a good, robust decision. So there are some positives there as well. It's not all doom and gloom.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Martha. So I'm just coming off mute there. Lots of questions and observations coming through the chat. In sifting those, I think quite a few observations around how different institutions have shifted the rhythm of their interaction as far as governing body meetings are concerned, shifting to monthly, but also with more regular interactions, feedback and observations around having briefings in the manner that Steve and I think Michael spoke to, and that you indicated as well, Martha. In choosing which areas to pick up on, I would like just to perhaps focus initially in the time we have available on one piece that it cuts across a lot of the feedback areas, which is the burden question upon governing bodies. So we have a model of trusteeship in UK higher education. It's a volunteer model. It is predicated on individuals giving freely of their time. A few institutions do offer stipendiary remuneration for certain roles, but they are the minority. And if I could offer a contention, which is this, that if you have to be capable of giving up your time for free to participate as a trustee, we are automatically imposing a limit upon our capacity to invest in the diversity of our governance community, because we are by definition excluding a part of society that cannot give freely of its time. And I'd be interested in, that's not to say an argument for payment, it's not necessarily an argument for professionalisation, but it strikes me as, and I think it's sort of within some of the points we're making, as an issue that we can't choose to ignore. And Martha, as you spoke last, I'd like you to invite you to speak first on this. Do you have any particular reflections around, when looking at this lens through inclusivity and governance, and the burden or the pressure upon governing bodies to engage with a greater rhythm and intensity as we are seeing? Any reflections on how we navigate that from your perspective, please?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, many student governors are actually in quite a good position with this. They're already remunerated for their kind of day-to-day role, and so therefore this forms part of that experience for them. But yeah, it is really important. We need, a real diversity of thought and experience and of background, of career stages. We need, younger voices in the room. We need people who are at different stages in their career. And we need them to feel like they have the time and the space to really understand issues, to get to grips with what they're being asked to do, and also to feel they can challenge. I mean, I've loved my experience of being at the OFS, and I've always felt very welcomed and very kind of valued on that board. But I mean, there are knighthoods and there are CVEs in that room, there are very big job titles, and it can be really daunting to go into that and feel like, I know that I can add value, but sometimes it's hard to kind of see what I can add to that experience and that voice. And so, yeah, I think there is a real emphasis now on how can we encourage those in, how can we support them better, whether that's through remuneration, but also through training and through building up good relationships, and just I mean, even just in the bits of things we lose in the margins when we're on virtual platforms, colleagues who've just kind of on the way out of the door just said, oh, by the way, I spoke to a colleague and they gave me some really good feedback about you, or there's little confidence boosters as well. It's so important, but then they've evaporated in the current landscape. We need to find a way to put them back in the room as well.
Thank you, Martha. I will draw Stephen and Michael in if I may, but there's something very important in what you said there about in that example of feedback that you gave is about trying to put yourself in the position of the lived experience of those other colleagues around us when they have a very different lived experience. It's very difficult for us, but it's part of our being empathetic and engaging with those colleagues who, in the fundamental, we all have moments where we think, do I have a right to be here? Some of us have it more often than not. And part of what you're saying there is to really support all of us in that environment, particularly in this scenario. Time as always is against us, but that's been such valuable input. Could I get your reflections on this exchange, Steve, and then perhaps Michael as well? But Steve first, please.
Yeah, I've had the imposter syndrome since I was born, I think. So it stays with you. It doesn't matter where you are. It stays with you. I think my experience actually is I increasingly believe that our boards probably need to look more like the boards that I'm experienced in NHS land. I just think that they still have the diversity, but actually it's broader for the very reason that you said. And it's not paying a salary. It's about just providing some level of remuneration that offers at least expenses plus a little bit more. But it's more important, actually, because there's then a very clear line that the chair has with every board member. And that's about getting the best out of the board members and their performance and their engagement. And there is something about them doing their homework as a result of having some framework that they're working within. It also allows you, I think, to reach out to groups where you are looking for more diversity, so you can actively help and encourage different diverse views around the board table. I also think that actually, when you get boards that are very large, they become pretty dysfunctional, and you have folk who sit back and probably contribute very little, and then you have others who are really pushing very hard. So, I reckon the NHS probably has got it right. I think big acute trusts have probably got around eight or nine on their boards. That feels about right.
Thank you for that. Just coming off mute there, and Michael, your reflections on this exchange. How do you see this narrative?
I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I think that the historical model of people sitting on the boards or councils of universities at a stage of their career when they feel they want to give back, almost by definition, means it's not going to be as diverse as you might ideally like. And I don't think there are any easy answers, but I do think that if we want to attract the level of diversity, and particularly people who are maybe at an earlier stage of their career, we do need to think about giving some form of compensation for their the opportunity cost of them not doing something else to provide for their family. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. But I think equally, there will continue to be a group of people who are on the boards because they genuinely believe. I mean, my role into this is that higher education for me was the thing that unlocked all the life chances that nobody else in my family had. And therefore I was passionate about giving something back and helping other people to experience that. So for me, and I think it's still important to attract people with that kind of objective. And therefore you need a mechanism whereby there is no, some people will get remunerated because we really want them to be on the council, and others will either be given a notional amount that is kept by the university or goes to a student hardship fund or something like that. I think there are models that we can use that will deal with that. But I do think at the moment we are not making enough inroads into this diversity issue, and I think the ability to reward people for their time would be one of the things that would help.
Thank you. Martha, if I could draw you into this exchange as we move towards sort of our last 5 minutes in this panel session. We've got an audience here of close to sort of 150 plus colleagues from all sorts of backgrounds, governance professionals, lay governors, student and staff governors, chairs, and consultants. If you were to leave our audience with any particular sort of message or key reflection that you've perhaps taken in thinking about this discussion and thinking about the key governance issues of the moment as you see them, what would be perhaps your headline reflection or call for action, if I could call it that?
I mean, I think the overarching issue is always communication. It's ensuring that the way that you're presenting board papers are user-friendly. It's ensuring that there's that communication between board meetings and that those in the room on the day feel able to contribute. But it's also, if you're working with a student governor, particularly, or a new governor, or someone who's at another stage in their career, just reaching out sometimes, checking they're okay. If you work with students and you haven't spoken to them for a little while, just pick up the phone or send them an email or have a little chat and just see how they're getting on, because actually there may well be things they want to share with you but don't quite feel confident or empowered enough yet to do so. Inductions are all well and good, but we're halfway through the year, but it's not too late to build that relationship up.
Thank you. That's really eloquently put. And Steve, headline for you, sort of the audience that we have for this session, the conversations, the exchange we had, what would be your key message back to our colleagues listening to this if there was a call for action in this whole area for you?
I think very similar. Communications, relationships are key. Honesty and transparency is key. And I work on the basis of no surprises. If a board member reads something in the press first, we've failed.
Understood. Thank you. Michael, as we wrap up this panel session, any further reflections? You'll have seen some of the chat coming through as well. Anything that we've maybe not picked up that you'd like to draw into the exchange and share reflections on?
No, I think the only thing I would say, and I try and say this to all groups of particularly university staff, is our university system is an awful lot better than the people that work in it sometimes think it is. So we're often far too down on ourselves about what, just how good we are. And I think we need to have a sense of we are incredible as a sector, but we can go further. We can learn from other sectors without feeling beaten up that means we must be doing something wrong. We can extend what we're doing, and we can really make an impact on all of our societies, and in particular on the students that are coming through our universities. These are formidable institutions, and we just need to recognise that and continue in a sense of positivity to make improvements.
Thank you. Well, we're just coming up to 2 minutes before we conclude this panel session, and I think then there's a break before we then kick into the next round of activities for today's governance conference. I really would like to, on behalf of everyone participating and observing and engaging through the chat, thank our panel members for their reflections and discussions. Like with a lot of these issues, there is such richness to be explored. It always feels one is never doing it a full service, or indeed one is doing it a disservice to constrain this exchange to simply 40 minutes. But I hope for the benefit of colleagues who've been observing and participating, and thank you for doing so and sharing your questions and experiences, it's drawn out some of the issues that really matter. Linking this debate to the underlying drive for inclusivity within our governance community, how we unpack that, how we drive that, how we are leaderful in that regard, and looking for those levers and those tools that we can activate and make better use of to be attractive, to encourage, to nurture, and indeed, to borrow a word from Martha, to mentor and support the next generation of those who will be coming into our governance community in whatever form or role, to enable them to and equip them to be effective and support this fantastic sector of which we're all quite rightfully so proud. So without further ado, and I think I now make it coming up to 22 the hour, I'd like to thank all our colleagues again, and thank you for the feedback and the debate that we've had. And I think we'll wrap up this session now and invite colleagues to take a break before we kick off at noon. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Martha. And thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye for now.